Watch the ride.
Hey everybody, I've been meaning to make this video for a while now because after talking to lots of different people from different countries and seeing arguments on the internet between people about this subject, I thought I'd clarify for anyone wondering what measurements and things do we use in the UK. Because a lot of people think we are 100% metric and some people have even seem to think we're still imperial. You know, I've seen arguments on videos of people saying this is in kilometres an hour and they're like, no, this is UK, it's miles an hour. And then somebody was saying, no, the UK uses kilometres an hour because they use metric. They're like, I'm from England, we don't. You know, it's ridiculous. So I thought I'd run through some of the basics, because some of it's a bit weird, the way we do things, depending on what it is. So let's start with tools. Well, we use metric, basically, with tools these days. I think anyone younger than about 40, 50, something like that, will have used metric as they grew up. Unless their dad or granddad brought them up using imperial, although working on things that had fasteners that were imperial. Because obviously if you have imperial-sized nuts, you can't really use metric stuff unless it happens to be one of the ones that crosses over, because there's always that slight difference. But when it comes to tooling, we use metric, so it's millimetres. Well, unless we're talking about ratchets, and then it's 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch fittings. And we still get like £3 lump hammers and so many pound hammers. It's just tradition that we still use that. Same as when it comes to wood, you still buy wood in the sizes that it always was bought in, you know, like 2x4 and 4x4 and, you know, stuff like that. Which is obviously 4x4, 2x4 is 2 inches by 4 inches. So right away there, when it comes to measurements, it's a mixture of imperial and metric. Food. For a long time now, all of our food has been weighed in kilograms and grams. I have to say here, because going slightly back to the tools, the metric system makes so much more sense. Even some Americans admit, not all of them, some are very, very, very precious to their imperial sizes, but many Americans that I know think that the metric system just makes more sense. I mean, think about it. You know, you've got millimetres. Well, there's 10 millimetres to a centimetre, and there's 100 centimetres to a metre, and there's 1,000 metres to a kilometre. You know, it's an easy step up in the same way that you have a milliliter, then you have centilitres, litres. It's done the same way, and the weight, so like with the grams. So when it comes to food, we use kilos and grams. So there is 1,000 grams in a kilogram, kilometre. But this hasn't always been the case. I can remember when it was a law that was brought in that meant that they had to sell things in metric. And a lot of people kicked up saying, I don't want to go and ask for 400 grams of beef, I want to go and ask for a pound of beef. And they're like, well, you still can do that, but they have to list it under the grams. And that's why you'll find a lot of things have both in the UK when it comes to food and stuff. But it interchanges, because we're talking about weights here of food and measurements of tools and things like that. But when it comes to the human body, we do things totally differently. We weigh, body weight is done in stones, pounds and ounces. If you were born... Now, I was born in 85, and I find that anyone more than 5 or 6 years younger than me will be using centimetres for height, and they'll be using kilos for weight, and it's just very normal for them to do that. And obviously with weight, it makes a lot of sense. But generally, in the grand scheme of things, people, if you ask someone how tall they are, they're going to give you your height in feet and inches. Because, for instance, I'm 6'4", but that would work out to be 193 centimetres or 1.93 metres. So, you know, it's easy to break that up. And you, of course, just move the decimal point. So it's easy. You don't have to go to fractions and all those sorts of things, which it makes working on things and picking up the skills and understanding things a lot simpler for people when everything is broken down into the same units rather than all these fractions. Though if you were brought up knowing the fractions, that wouldn't be a problem for you. So when it comes to measuring a human, we use imperial. When it comes to measuring something else, we use metric. Well, unless it's some specific thing we still use imperial for. Food is generally done in metric, and general weights are done in metric, unless you're weighing a person, in which case we use imperial. And in fact, we don't just use imperial, we use stones, pounds and ounces. And to Americans, as I understand it, you'll be confused by the term stone. So there is 14 pounds to a stone, there are 16 ounces to a pound, and a pound is the equivalent of 453 grams, because there is 2.246 pounds to every kilo. So in America people say, oh, I'm 200 pounds. And that's very normal for you to do. Well, we still do it in pounds, but we break it down. So in the stone, it would end up being 14 stone 4 ounces. I understand how that makes it more confusing, and the way that America uses weights of people in pounds is much simpler because you know the number. You don't have to do the fractional, like, well, there's 14, so if there's 2 of this, and it's just easier to understand the way that they do it. If you're going to use it, stone just complicates things. But we don't really use stone for anything else other than weighing people. So if you're human weights, someone might say, oh, well, I'm 200 pounds, or they could say I'm 14 stone 4, or if they were they were younger and they did things in metric, sorry, this is confusing my brain, is 90.9 kilos. This is one that's caused a lot of arguments I've seen on the internet. People think because we use, say, the metric system, they think that we would use kilometres an hour on our roads, and we would talk about distances in kilometres. We don't. We use miles an hour, and we use miles, unlike Texas that uses time. No, seriously, if you know anyone from Texas, you say to them, how far away is that? They'll just say, oh, it's about 2 hours. They'll never say, oh, it's about 55 miles. A bit of a joke, but it is kind of actually true. So, yeah, roads, all of our roads have got markings in miles, not kilometres. That technically should change, shouldn't it? Like with all the foods being forced, we should have road signs that say 60 miles an hour or 101 or 102 kilometres an hour. I'm trying to remember the difference. So that's distances and speeds on roads. Well, how about you're filling your car up with fuel? Do you do it by the gallon? No, we do it by the litre. Well, we buy it by the litre, but then we work out our MPGs by the gallon. We don't do it by litre, because that's more of an understood standard, as I understand it. So I can understand where people get confused, because they're like, well, you use metric for measuring tools, why aren't you using it on the roads? It's like, well, because we just don't, in the same way that we don't do our weight in kilos, unless you're a certain age. Though I will add here, because some people will say, hang on a minute, I do this, or we do that, or my area does this, or everyone I know does that. I think it very much depends on your age, your area, what the schools were teaching at the time, what the local shops are doing, what your parents did, things like that. Another measurement that's always been kind of interesting to me has been motorcycle tyres, because you'll say, you know, a 1/6... Is this suddenly feeling like deja vu? Have you seen this before? Yeah, I uploaded this video last week, or earlier this week, and basically I made a couple of really obvious mistakes because I was talking so much about numbers and stuff, blah, 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 got it wrong. So I'm now re-uploading with these corrections. So there's only a couple. This is the first one, to do with motorcycle tyres. It's interesting how it's a mix of measurements. Motorcycle tyre sizes are done like 160, 60, 17, which means it's 160 millimetres wide. The 60 is an aspect ratio of the height of the sidewall versus the width of the tyre, and the 17 would be inches of the rim. So you see that's a bit of a weird thing, where we've got a mix of both metric and imperial in one measurement. There's also a letter code that comes after that, refers to speed ratings. And that's basically a really good example of how the UK works. We just pick and choose what we want to use. But generally, yes, metric is what is being taught these days. And it's the thing you really need to know rather than imperial, because most things, as I say, are built in metric rather than imperial. And for that reason, sometimes you need to have like two toolkits almost, because some cars use all metric and some cars use all imperial. The other advantage of metric actually is, like on bikes, you know what sizes you need. Easier, like for instance, you know, on a bike, bleed nipples normally, like on the brakes, normally like 6 mils. Fairing bolts and engine casing bolts, minor ones, they'd normally be 8 mils. 10 mils is your general fixings. Then you've got 14, which is used, we don't really use 11 that often. 14, 13's occasional, sometimes on the wing mirrors. 14's another common size when you're going a bit beefier. 16, 18, 17's never used, thinking about it. 19 mil is used, because that's what the axles on a lot of bikes are, 19 mil. I mean, like, this adjustable spanner, that's in metric. This adjustable one, that's an imperial. If you didn't have them, you wouldn't be able to do one or the other bolt, you know, you don't change one or anything. Oh, of course, then there's boats. Generally, boats are universal in, I think most people use knots. Knots being, a knot is a bit more than 1 mile an hour, so like 40 knots is about 45 mile an hour, something like that. I haven't checked that calculation, so don't check me on it, but it's a knot is a bit more than a mile an hour. And before someone says, hey, you know where that expression knot comes from? It's they had a rope that they basically dropped and it had knots at certain distances. You counted how many knots you had go through your hand through a certain amount of time, and that would tell you your speed. That's why it's knots, because it's how many knots on the rope pass through your hand in a set amount of time. Planes also use knots, I believe, but they might be different to the marine knots, aerial knots, aeronautical. I know, you know, you've got miles, but you've also got nautical miles, which are different. I've also noticed that between countries, the use of the terms like few, couple, stuff like that are not in line. Like, because in England, if you have one, you have one. If you have two, you have a couple. A couple always means two. But I've seen people in America refer to a couple as like 5, but that's a few in my book. I know this is getting ridiculous now. Okay, so moving on. When it comes to buying a drink in a pub, we don't say, hey, can I have 3/4 of a litre or wherever it is, or 16 ounces. Is it 16 ounces to a pint? We ask for a pint. It's a standard thing, always been pints. But otherwise you'd use millilitres and centilitres. When it comes to cooking, you don't also use so many millilitres. Millilitres, God, my mouth. Well, unless it comes down to like teaspoons and tablespoons. Angle grinders. The discs for this size, the common size, is 115 millimetres. Yet on the big ones, they're 12 inches, aren't they? I think they're 12 inch. So there's another example of where it's the exact same tool but a different size. If it's small, we say, oh, that's a 115 mil angle grinder bit. And if you go for a bigger one, they're like, well, that's a 12 incher. I can't think of any others off the top of my head now. If you can think of any, shove them in the comments. Let us know what you think, what you've heard. If this has been helpful in any particular way, I don't think it's very interesting to anyone in England. But I can understand the confusions of like people thinking we use metric, because if you use metric, well then it's for everything, isn't it? It's like, well, tools are metric, food's metric, but if I'm going to weigh me, then I use Imperial, or if I'm going to see how tall I am, I'm going to use Imperial, unless I was born in after about 1990. Oh, and of course in America, when it comes to big weights, like you'd say a car weighs 4,000 pounds, we'd say it was so many tons, but I think you do that as well. But some people also in the UK would say it's this much in kilos, but don't tend to do it when it gets into tons, because then it's a more quantifiable known thing, so we use tons instead. Oh, here's another funny one to do with fasteners when it comes to tools. If you buy a bolt... Okay, this one I got wrong, and I cannot believe that I didn't notice in the edit, and I didn't notice when I said it, because it was silly. But if you have an M8 bolt, basically the M8 refers to millimetres, and that is the thickness of the shaft of the bolt itself, not the head, like I said. Don't know how I got that one wrong. So if you buy a bolt, you want an 8mm shafted bolt that's 30mm long, you get an M8 30. So that's an 8mm diameter of the shaft and a 30mm long bolt. Unless you want to buy screws, and then they're like half-inch, 2 inches, aren't they? Something like that. And even, I think, tacks, you get like half-inch tacks. When I say tacks, I don't know if who else uses this term, but a tack would be a headless nail. Well, it's basically a headless nail. When it comes to shoe sizes, we have our own number system, which is very similar to the American system in that it's only, I think the American sizes are like half a size slightly bigger or something. It's almost comparable. Whereas if you go to a European size, it would be more like a 48. Rather than like, for instance, yeah, I mean, hang on, I can tell, I've got boots on. My UK 13.5 is a Euro 48.5, which is an American 14, which is a 32 in Japan. Okay, so I think that's all of the measurements and weights and different examples where we use one thing but then counterintuitively use a different thing. And I can understand where this argument comes from. And don't feel bad about it, because let's always remember that the Hubble Space Telescope was made wrong because someone didn't do the conversions between inches and millimetres properly, or something like that. It was they didn't grind the mirror right, and it was to do with a conversion between millimetres and inches, or is that a old wives' tale? There you go, like this video if you like it. I know it's a bit different from my normal videos, but I just see so many people getting confused over this, I thought I'd try and clarify some of it. If you've got anything to add, please go ahead, put it in the comments. If you find anything weird, or if I've got anything wrong about what Americans use, feel free to correct me. I'm just trying to help some people understand that we actually use a mix, basically. And there is no rhyme nor reason to why we use certain things, apart from it just tends to come down to common sense, what's easier and more understood. But of course, remember, don't get your Imperial and metric adjustable spanners mixed up. It's a nightmare. If you enjoyed this video and the other content on the channel, please consider following the links in the description to show your support.